Nobody sits down one morning, sips their coffee, and thinks today is the day I become a prepper. Something has to happen first. Something that cracks the comfortable story you've been telling yourself about how the world works. And once that crack appears, you can't unsee it. That moment hits differently for everyone, but it hits. And after spending more than a decade inside the preparedness world, I've noticed something that almost nobody talks about. The people who actually stick with this, the ones who build real skills and real systems and real peace of mind, they almost always point back to a single moment. A before and after. Today, I'm going to share mine, and I'll bet somewhere in this story you're going to recognize your own. It started with a snowstorm. Nothing dramatic on the surface, just another cold Colorado morning where the sky looked a little gray and the forecast said things might get a bit worse later in the day. I had a 40-mile commute to work at the time, about an hour each way on a good day. I grabbed my jacket, didn't think twice, and headed out. The roads were fine when I left, a little slick maybe, but nothing that screamed stay home. So I went. The problem is that snowstorms don't always announce what they're actually planning to do. You look out the window at work and think, that's not so bad. Then an hour passes. You look again. That's starting to look worse. Another hour goes by. Now you're staring out that window thinking, if I don't leave right now, I might not make it home tonight. That was me. That was exactly me standing at that window doing the math. I made the call to leave a couple hours early and hit the road. What happened next is what I think about every time someone tells me they don't need to prepare for anything. The moment I got in my car, the storm escalated, not gradually. Suddenly, like the weather had been patiently waiting for me to make myself vulnerable before showing its hand. By the time I was about 10 miles from home, I was in serious trouble. My little front-wheel drive car was barely holding the road, and I hit a decision point. There was a turn ahead that would take me onto a 10-mile stretch of road. One lane. No gas stations, no businesses, no help if something went wrong. If that car stopped moving on that road, I was completely on my own. So I didn't take the turn. I pulled off where there were at least some buildings nearby, and that was the right call. Because the car stopped. It just stopped. It wasn't going anywhere. So there I was, stranded, cell coverage out there was spotty at best. I was trying to reach my wife and kids and getting nothing. Just silence and static and the sound of wind pushing snow against the windows. That silence was worse than anything else. When you can't reach the people you love and you have no idea what's happening at home, your brain doesn't stay calm. It goes immediately to the worst case. Every single time. Are they okay? Did they try to come find me and end up on the side of the road somewhere? What if something happened and I have no way of knowing? I had maybe an hour of daylight left. I wasn't going to sit there and wait to be someone else's problem in the middle of the night. So I got out of the car and I started walking toward the nearest hotel. Could have been a mile. Felt like 10. But I got there. Checked in. And then I sat in that room alone with my thoughts for the entire night. That hotel room was genuinely one of the longest nights of my life. Not because anything catastrophic was happening, but because I had no information and no control. My mind filled the silence with the worst possible versions of what could be going on. That's what happens when you're unprepared. You don't just face the physical problem in front of you. You face the mental and emotional weight of knowing you didn't think ahead. You face the helplessness. And helplessness is a heavy thing to sit with in a quiet room while snow piles up outside. I eventually fell asleep. Morning came. I got through to my family. Everyone was home. Everyone was fine. Relief doesn't quite capture what I felt. It was more like pressure releasing all at once. I went outside, dug the car out using nothing but an ice scraper because I had nothing useful in that car, and slowly made my way home. The first thing I did when I walked through the door was hug my family. The second thing I did was start looking at four-wheel drive vehicles, because that little Saturn was never going to be my daily driver again. But something else happened that same day. My wife brought up preparedness. Not for the first time, honestly, she had been interested in it for a while. Food storage, supplies, thinking ahead. I had always kind of nodded along without really engaging with it. But this time I actually listened. Because I had just spent a night in a hotel room alone, terrified, unable to reach my family, with nothing useful in my car. The message had finally gotten through to me the hard way. What happened next is something a lot of people in this community will recognize immediately. I went completely overboard. And I mean that in the most enthusiastic way possible. I started watching every video I could find. I read the books. I looked up gear reviews at midnight. I started building this mental list of everything I needed to buy and everything I needed to know. I was ordering things online that I barely understood the purpose of. Water filters? Absolutely everyone seems to need one. A big fixed blade knife? Obviously, tactical bags with 17 compartments? You know it. I was watching every survival show I could get my hands on. I was reading through every forum thread and every article about grid-down scenarios and bug-out plans and communication systems. It was exciting. That's the honest truth. When you first step into preparedness, there is a real rush to it. You feel like you're finally doing something, like you're finally taking the wheel after years of just being a passenger. But then, something shifts. It usually happens somewhere between the 1-year mark and the 2-year mark. The credit card bills start stacking up. You look around at all this stuff you've accumulated and you start asking a real question. Do I actually know what I'm doing with any of this? Or did I just buy a bunch of things that make me feel prepared without actually making me prepared? That question, when you're honest enough to ask it, is when the real learning begins. Because that's when you start to understand what preparedness is actually about. And it's not about the gear. It never was. The gear is a small part of a much larger picture. I had to learn that the hard way too. Because I spent a year chasing products and watching unboxing videos and reading about which brand of freeze-dried food was superior to which other brand, and none of that actually addressed the core thing I had been looking for since that snowstorm. None of it answered the question I had been asking without realizing I was asking it. And that question was simply this: what do I do when things go wrong? Not what do I own? What do I do? There is a massive difference between those two things. Think about that night in the hotel. The thing that tortured me wasn't that I didn't have the right piece of gear. I had a functioning car. I had a credit card. I found a hotel. The thing that tortured me was that I had no plan. I had never once thought about what I would do if I got caught in a bad storm on my way home from work. I hadn't thought about how I would reach my family if my phone wasn't working reliably. I hadn't thought about what I would need to have in my car to handle a cold weather emergency. I hadn't thought about any of it. And not thinking about it wasn't laziness. It was just the way most people move through life. You assume things will work out. You rely on probably and maybe. You cross your fingers and trust in the system. Most of the time that works out fine, right up until it doesn't. Here's what preparedness actually gave me. Not a truck, not a shelf full of supplies, not a collection of knives and radios and water filtration gear. Those things matter, and I'm not going to tell you they don't. But the thing that preparedness actually gave me was confidence. Real, grounded, tested confidence in my ability to handle whatever came next without starting from absolute zero. That confidence changes how you move through the world. It changes how you think about problems before they happen. It changes how you respond when something unexpected hits. Because now, you're not panicking and scrambling and trying to remember if there's anyone you can call. You already thought about it. You already made a plan. You already have some version of a resource for this situation, whatever it is. That is the difference between someone who has spent time preparing and someone who hasn't. And this is the part that people who dismiss preparedness almost always miss. They see the gear. They see the stockpiles. They watch a few videos about emergency food and bug-out bags, and they think, okay, that's kind of extreme. That's not for me. And they move on. What they never see is the mental shift that happens when you actually do this for a while. When you start thinking about your life through the lens of what would I do if. That shift doesn't make you paranoid. Eventually, and this takes a while to get there, it makes you calmer. It makes you less reactive. It makes you someone who can look at a developing situation and say, okay, I've already thought through something like this. Let me just work the plan. I've talked to hundreds of people over the years about why they got into preparedness, at events, through comments, through conversations that went longer than they were supposed to because we both just kept going. And every single story is different in its details. Some people went through hurricanes. Some went through extended flooding. Some dealt with week-long power outages where the generator ran out of fuel on day 4, and suddenly it was a very different situation than they'd planned for. Some people's turning points were personal, a job loss, a medical crisis, a moment where the safety net they assumed would be there simply wasn't. But the structure of the story is always the same. Something happens. Something makes the invisible visible. Something shows you how thin that margin really is between ordinary life and genuine chaos. And then you make a decision. You either go back to normal and file it under one of those things, or you let that moment change how you operate going forward. There's one pattern I notice more than any other, though, and it shows up across almost every conversation I've had about this topic. As people move through their 30s and into their 40s, something changes in how they relate to risk. When you're younger, risk feels abstract. It's something that happens to other people in other places under circumstances you're not going to find yourself in. But once you have a family, once there are people depending on you, the calculation changes completely. Because now, risk isn't just about you anymore. It's about the people you would do anything to protect. That shift in thinking is what turns a lot of people toward preparedness. Not fear, not paranoia. Responsibility, the honest recognition that you are the person who needs to have thought about this stuff, because if you haven't, then nobody in your house has. I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in this space, and that's the relationship between preparedness and stress. Because there's a common assumption that prepping makes you more anxious. And honestly, in the beginning, it kind of does. When you first start learning about everything that could potentially go wrong, it can feel overwhelming. You start to see risk everywhere. You start to wonder why you ever felt safe before. That's a phase. Almost everyone goes through it. But if you stick with it, something interesting happens on the other side of that phase. Your relationship with uncertainty changes. Because you've started doing something about it. And doing something about something, even imperfectly, even incompletely, relieves a particular kind of anxiety that comes from feeling helpless. Every time you add a layer of preparation to your life, you are choosing action over passivity. And that choice compounds over time in ways that are hard to describe until you've experienced it yourself. Think about COVID and the early days of the shortages. Shelves were empty. People were stressed and scrambling. That situation was genuinely difficult for a lot of people. But if you were someone who had already been quietly building a pantry, who already had supplies at home, who had already thought even briefly about what you'd do if stores were limited, that moment felt completely different. You weren't scrambling, You had options. You could wait. You could think clearly. You could be the calm one in your household instead of the stressed one. That's not a small thing. That's exactly the kind of situation that makes all of this worth doing. Options, that's one of the 4 things I've come to believe preparedness truly gives you. When everyone else is in reactive mode, you have options. You're not forced into a single path. You can choose. The second thing is confidence, which I've already spent a lot of time on, but I want to add one more dimension to it. Confidence in a crisis is not just emotionally useful, it's practically useful. When you're calm, you think better. When you think better, you make fewer mistakes. When you make fewer mistakes, outcomes improve. That's not opinion. That's just how human cognition works under stress. Preparedness, by giving you something to draw on, literally makes you better at handling emergencies. The third thing is peace of mind. And I know that sounds soft. I know in a world of tactical gear and freeze-dried protein and bug-out vehicle builds, talking about peace of mind might seem out of place. But it is the thing that most people who stick with preparedness will tell you matters most to them. It's the ability to go to sleep without lying awake thinking about what would happen if. Because you've already thought about what would happen if. You've already taken steps. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to cover every possible scenario. But you've thought about it and you've done something, and that is enough to let your nervous system stand down a little bit. The fourth thing is reduced stress, which connects directly to peace of mind but is worth naming separately, because the background stress of living in an uncertain world without any preparation is real, even if most people can't name it. It hums quietly under the surface of modern life. The feeling that things could go sideways and you wouldn't know what to do. Preparedness doesn't eliminate that feeling completely, but it turns down the volume significantly. So if you're sitting here thinking about all of this, maybe you're new to it, maybe you've been circling it for a while, maybe you had your own version of that snowstorm and you just haven't done anything about it yet. I want to tell you something directly. You don't have to go buy 17 things tonight. You don't have to overhaul your entire life this weekend. Preparedness is not a destination. It's a direction. You pick a direction and you start moving, even slowly, even imperfectly, and you keep moving. That's all it takes to start seeing the difference in how you feel. Start with the most likely things, not the dramatic edge case scenarios you see talked about in certain corners of the internet. The realistic everyday disruptions, power outages, bad weather, a job suddenly gone, a car that breaks down at the worst possible time, a medical expense that clears out your savings. Those things happen constantly to real people. That is where preparedness earns its keep. Build from there. Think about what your family would need if you couldn't get to a store for a week. What would you need if the power was out for several days? What would you do if you couldn't reach someone you love and you needed to know they were okay? Start there. Those questions are more useful than any product review. The tools and the gear matter. I'm not dismissing them, but they are downstream of the thinking. You think first. Then you equip. And look, I want to say something that I think matters a lot. Preparedness did not make me afraid of the world. I want to be very clear about that, because I think that's the story some people tell themselves to avoid engaging with any of this. They think that if they start paying attention to what could go wrong, they'll become anxious or pessimistic or weird about it, and maybe for a brief stretch in the beginning, that happens. But the destination is the opposite of that. Preparedness made me less afraid. Because most of the things I used to worry about in the background, those low-level hums of what if, I've already thought through them. I've already addressed them as well as I reasonably can. And because of that, I don't carry them around the same way anymore. I can look at a rough forecast and feel equipped instead of anxious. I can watch the news without dread sitting on my chest. I can focus on the people around me and the life in front of me because I've done my part to take care of the things that are actually within my control. There are things that aren't within your control. Obviously, there are scenarios so large and so catastrophic that no individual amount of preparation is going to make a decisive difference. Those scenarios exist, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But they are also the least likely things on the spectrum. And spending the majority of your mental energy on the least likely things, at the expense of the most likely things, is not a good trade. Think about the probable. Prepare for the probable. Let the improbable inform your thinking without consuming it. That's the balance that takes time to find. But once you find it, the whole thing starts to feel sustainable. It stops being a reaction to fear and starts being just part of how you live, part of how you think about your household, your family, your resources, your time. Looking back at that snowstorm, I have a complicated relationship with that memory. It was genuinely awful in the moment. I don't want to romanticize it. It was cold and stressful, and I was scared and alone, and I didn't know if my family was okay. That's not a fun memory. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't grateful for it. Not because suffering is somehow noble, but because that experience cracked something open in me that I probably would have kept ignoring. My wife had been talking about preparedness for a while, and until that night, it just hadn't fully landed. I'd hear it, nod along, and then go back to assuming everything would probably work out. After that night, I couldn't do that anymore. The probably was gone. And I had to build something to replace it. What I built over years wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a retreat location or a massive cache of supplies or a compound. What I built was a mindset, a way of thinking about my household and my family and our situation that accounts for the reality that things sometimes go sideways without warning, that plans don't always hold, that the weather doesn't check your calendar before it gets serious, that systems you depend on can fail, and that when those things happen, the quality of your response depends almost entirely on how much thinking you did before they happened. That's what a decade plus of preparedness looks like from the inside. It looks like a mindset more than anything else. And that mindset is available to you right now. You don't need a warehouse. You don't need a large budget. You need to start thinking. Start with the most obvious vulnerabilities in your daily life and begin addressing them, one at a time, at whatever pace makes sense for your situation. The people who make this a lifetime practice, and there are a lot of them, they'll tell you the same thing no matter what their specialty is or how they got into it. It starts with something that scared them or shook them or made them feel helpless. And it ends, eventually, with something that feels a lot like freedom. Because you have thought through the hard things. Because you have done something about the things you can control. Because you aren't starting from zero when life decides to test you. And because you stopped crossing your fingers and hoping and started actually building something solid to stand on. That's what this is really about. Not the gear, not the stockpiles, not the scenarios and the checklists and the acronyms. The confidence, the options, the peace of mind, the lower volume on that background anxiety. All of it together, built slowly, one decision at a time, adds up to something that actually changes how you live. If you made it this far, I want to hear from you. Drop your story in the comments. What was your moment? What was the thing that made you start paying attention? Was it a storm, a power outage, a personal crisis, something that happened to someone you love? Every story is different in the details and the same in the shape. And sharing those stories matters, because somewhere in yours, someone else is going to recognize their own. and maybe that's the thing that finally gets through to them. If this gave you something to think about, make sure you hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find this content and find their way into this community. This is my channel, and we keep coming back to the thing that actually matters here, which isn't gear or gear or gear. It's the decision to stop leaving your safety up to chance. Real confidence isn't built on the assumption that nothing will ever go wrong. Real confidence is built on knowing that if it does, you won't be starting from zero. You've already done the thinking. You've already taken the steps. You're already in the direction that matters. And that, more than anything you can buy, is what preparedness is actually for.